He came to Greece for light and sea, for the promise that a week of wind and salt could sand down the edges of a life grown too square. His name was Matthias Kruger, 40 years old, unmarried, an IT support engineer from Munich who counted his years by the guidebooks he shelved. He had been to Lisbon and Lofoten, to Sylt in winter when the dunes were stripped to bone, and to Vienna because someone told him that in that city even the coffee had a schedule. He walked more than he spoke. He kept small notebooks in which he wrote two kinds of entries: lists, replace sink washer, repot basil, fix wobbly chair, and sentences that were almost poems, goals like paper kites, smell of diesel and fish, sea is metal today. He told no one, not really, why he needed to go to the islands that summer. He had ended a long, quiet relationship in April. Although ended was too active a verb for what had in fact simply worn away. He felt himself becoming the kind of man who stares too long at his own hands. His mother in Freiburg, who had the talent mothers have for reading texts that say nothing, asked if he was all right. He wrote back, "I'm fine. I'll go south a little. Need sun. Don't worry." He bought a guidebook whose maps were too simple and a pair of boots whose leather he oiled carefully 2 nights before departure. The boots were what he trusted in every place he did not yet know. The island he picked was not a famous one. It had a lighthouse and a ferry that ran too seldom, a single double-laned road that thinned to 1 lane long before it reached the northern headland, a whitewashed church where the bell rope had been fixed with old blue nylon, and the bell itself was dented, as if weather had knocked at it for too many years with hard knuckles. People on larger islands used it as a punchline. If you want to disappear, try Akritos, but they said it without malice. Akritos had a harbor where boats nudged one another like sheep waiting for a gate to open. Bougainvillea burst in magenta over walls so white they hurt the eye at noon. Cats coiled like ropes on warm stone. The lighthouse stood on the farthest point, a slim cylinder painted the color of ship bones, built in the 19th century by French engineers who had measured the wind and made a note about the way it changed its mind at exactly 5 in the afternoon. Between the village and the lighthouse the coast ran ragged. The Meltemi in summer scoured the cliffs and sharpened them, turned the sea glassy one day and angry the next. There were caves under the rock, blowholes that made a noise like a god clearing his throat when the tide rushed in. On Monday, the innkeeper's wife copied his passport details and told him with the hospitality practiced by islands that cannot afford not to be kind that breakfast would be bread, honey, figs, and whatever the fisherman brought. He told her his plan: a long walk along the northern path to the lighthouse, then down to the Skerries in the morning, then back before the heat took the day hostage. She nodded at the weather with that skeptical Greek tilt that means the sky is not a contract. "Road to the north is okay," she said, "but not too close to the edge. The sea is a very patient thief." He smiled because he liked how sentences became aphorisms here. He went to the harbor and watched 2 men haul octopus from a tub and beat it on stone in a rhythm so ancient it felt like part of the tide timetable. He took photographs he'd never show to anyone. He bought a bottle of water and a bun and sat in the shade. When the ferry untied in the afternoon, he stood to one side and watched a roll of tourists spool off and onto the island like thread into a needle. The islands I did not blink. On Tuesday, he followed the path north for the first time. The map called it a road, but it was in truth a ribbon of pale dust and stones with goat prints stitched across it. The path walked the top of the cliff like a line in a school exercise book that someone had written along, careful not to cross. To his right, the sea lay like metal hammered flat. To his left, the hills were olive groves and terraces long since abandoned because the city had drained the young from the villages and left behind only houses that leaned into each other like old men do. He learned the smell of time crushed under a boot, of warm stone, of salt dried in his hair. He learned the sound a gull makes when it complains about nothing. He learned the small Greek word for hello and used it too often. He reached the lighthouse at noon and sat in its shade. The paint flaked under his fingers. He wrote, lenses like stacked glass, screws star-headed, door chained, padlock the size of a plum. Keeper? No one. Light is automatic now. Everything tends toward automation. We push ourselves out of our own jobs. He walked back the long way and slept the heavy sleep of the well-warmed. In the morning, he sent a postcard to his mother. The air is salt and wine. I walk to the lighthouse every day. Don't worry. He loved that the stamp was a tiny painting of a boat. On Wednesday, he went to the police station because that was his habit in small places. Not because he distrusted them, but because he wanted to know what they knew. The police chief was a wiry man named Stavros with a mustache that had survived 3 fashions and 2 restructurings of the national police. He used English carefully, like a knife, and let Greek fill in the joints his English couldn't reach. "You walk alone?" he asked. "Alone is good. Alone is also sometimes foolish." He told Matthias about the caves under the North Cliffs and the way the tide could rise not only in height, but in speed. If the wind swings in the afternoon and you are down, the water runs into caves and does not run out again for a time. like a door that closes and forgets to open. Then he offered coffee and wrote Matthias's name on a slip of paper not because he expected trouble, but because he liked to count the strangers he had to account for. On Thursday, the Meltemi turned, a fact the old men predicted by watching a shutter and seeing how it flapped. The morning began soft, the sea like blue glass. Midday, the wind rose and tore a page from a newspaper at the cafe and sent it all the way to the post office without a step in between. A boatman at the quay said the North Water would be rough by evening. Matthias went out anyway. He liked walking toward weather. He thought of it as a conversation. The island said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I am sure." The island shrugged and said, "We will see." He passed goats whose bells sounded like someone shaking a small box of cutlery. He passed a woman washing steps who told him with the authority of someone who lived on stone that walking sandals were foolish on rock. He passed a boy with a fishing rod who asked him for a cigarette, and, when he said he did not smoke, scowled. At the lighthouse, he met an old man in a hat that might have been purchased in 1978. "No keeper," the old man said in German learned in Stuttgart in the 1980s. "Light is automatic, but the sea is not." The old man pointed with his chin to the path that led down to the skerries, low shelves of rock that lay like sleeping seals at the base of the headland. Good for pictures in the morning. In the afternoon, if the wind comes, bad. You will think the steps you took will still be there when you return. The sea is a patient thief. On Friday, he bought another bottle of water and a cheap little headlamp in a plastic blister because the shopkeeper said the caves were pretty and there was everything to be seen if one brought light. That was the sort of statement that makes trouble possible. He went north later than usual because he had sat too long with his coffee, because a German couple at the next table had asked him for directions he could not give and the conversation had eaten time. He set off at 5:30 because he liked dusk better than noon. The heat had melted into a caress. Shadows lengthened. He walked faster than usual to catch the light at the lighthouse. At the fork where the goat path led down, he paused, and the pause was a thing like a coin flipping in slow motion. There were 3 signs, a wooden one that said danger/Kappa Nu Omicron, a painted one that said no swimming, and a stone placed so that one had to move it aside to pass. He moved it aside as though moving thoughts aside. He took the steps, carved into rock decades earlier by hands that had needed a hidden place to land a boat at night, and felt the first chill of spray as waves rolled against the skerries. The stairs twisted in and out of a shadow, and then ended in a flat ledge of stone polished by countless uncounted storms. He turned and looked up at the path that now seemed much higher and farther than it had felt on the way down. He told himself he would sit for 5 minutes and go. He set his backpack down and took out his notebook and wrote, "Light on water like fish scales. Cave mouth at West End. Smell of old air." If steps were a sentence, it would say, "Come, but mind your return." He stood to peer into the cave because curiosity is a word that tastes like courage when you say it to yourself alone and like carelessness when said later by other people. He switched the headlamp on, and the beam looked puny and proud in equal measure. Inside, the cave narrowed to a corridor that bent left. The floor was wet with the breathable sheen of wave that comes and goes. He did not go in. He is not that foolish in the retelling. He stood at the lip and listened. He could not hear the indrawn breath of the cave that the locals say you can hear just before the water surges. He heard only the hum of his own blood and the clock tick of the lamp battery in his mind. On the path above, a woman who ran a small cafeteria in the village passed with 2 plastic bags and did not look down. At the lighthouse, a boy took a photograph of sunset and added a filter that made the sky more orange than truth permits, and then sent it to a girl he would not see again. In the harbor, Nikos the fisherman mended a net and told his cousin that the wind would turn again after midnight, and they should set their lines south. In the police station, Stavros signed a paper about a scooter that had been parked too close to the quay and filed it under later. Light left the flat parts first and retreated to the cliff face in fragments. Matthias had the sensation people have at certain kinds of edges, that the air in front of him was a wider kind of space, and that surely one more minute was owed to him if only because the minute he had just spent had been so good. The innkeeper's wife noticed at 10 that his room was still empty, the bed unslept. She told herself that tourists sometimes sit on rocks to think and lose track of hours. She told herself it was not her job to water other lives. At midnight, she stood in the door and looked up the street and knew in her sternum that something was off in the way things were supposed to balance. She woke her husband. He did the thing men do when their throat and stomach have agreed to warn each other. He put on his shoes without saying a word and went to the police. Stavros drove the northern road with his hand half on the horn because goats do not move for reason. The lighthouse beam turned its slow metronome sweep over stone, over water, over absence. At the fork, he found the stone moved aside, and that meant nothing and everything. He parked so that the headlamps faced the path down. He shouted a name into wind that did not care. He took the light and made his way to the top of the steps and saw only the sort of darkness that is not a lack of light, but a presence of something else. He did not go down alone. He had once, in his first year, climbed into such a space and learned for himself the truth about the way a cave can inhale. By dawn, there were 8 men on the headland, 3 police, a volunteer firefighter, the priest because priests are part of everything on small islands, and 3 fishermen who had all in different years pulled something from the sea that was not a fish. They rigged a rope, and 2 descended with torches. The light made a tunnel through spray and resolved nothing. The ledge where one could stand during a low swell was awash. They found a plastic bottle lodged in a crack that could have belonged to anyone. They found the mark of a boot heel in a patch of sand, but a wave smoothed it before they could argue about what it meant. "We wait for the wind," Nikos said. "When it lays down later, maybe we can see." They waited. Waiting is the thing the living do when the sea must be allowed to decide if it will give a person back. By noon, the helipad at the harbor had been cleared of motorbikes and gossip. A Coast Guard helicopter arrived from Syros and sucked the air into noise. The crew chief was a woman with hair braided into a rope and a voice that had no room for myth. She measured the cliff with a professional eye and told her pilot where to hover and told the ground crew not to wave their arms because that does not help anyone. The helicopter shivered like something alive that hated to be told what to do. 2 divers in black suits washed backward off RIB in the cove to the west and let themselves be pulled by the surge toward the cave entrance and then pulled back before they learned firsthand what the phrase blowhole means. They marked the cove with a buoy and dropped a line so that if a thing needed to be grabbed later, there would be something to grab. At 2 in the afternoon, the wind did its swing back to sensible, and the water went from knife to varnish in a pattern those who know the place could feel in their teeth. The divers went again. They squeezed past a pinch in the rock and into a chamber with a roof that had once been an idea softer than stone. They came back with nothing but the knowledge of the room's edges. There is a way the second day of a search makes the first look like a prologue. On the second day, the island reorganized itself around the absence. The cafenio closed so that the owner could hand out water on the headland. A schoolteacher became a linekeeper and did not once raise her voice because here there were no grades, only the yes or no of whether someone went too close to an edge. The priest brought a small icon and left it on a dry rock. He did not call it a bribe. He called it company. A man with a drone flew it in a pattern the Coast Guard told him to fly and did not improvise. People from the next island over brought ropes and quiet. Stavros made 3 lists: places searched, places to search, places no one should go. He wrote Matthias's name at the top of each because sometimes order is another way to talk to the world. Elena, a woman who walked fast and who had an opinion about everything and who lost a brother at sea in 1987, brought her dog. The dog gave the air a frank assessment and chose to sit with its back to the cliff because dogs can afford to tell truth. At noon, a rumor ran through the crowd that a backpack had been found 2 coves east. It had not. At 3, someone said they saw a shirt in the water. It was foam. At 5, a retired naval officer with a voice like command told a reporter there are 3 kinds of missing: those found on the day, those found when the sea wants to tidy, and those not found. The third, he said, is a kind of sentence that goes on past punctuation. The reporter wrote it down as if quotes are shells you can put to your ear later and still hear the sea. By the 3rd day, there was a meeting at the town hall whose roof tiles had not been replaced since the currency changed, and men who had not been in the same room since a fight over a mooring space in 1992 sat side by side, because the island's spine was bigger than their argument. They agreed to keep searching until Sunday. They agreed to feed people who came to help. They agreed, reluctantly, to tell tourists not to go north for a week because there are kinds of quiet that should not be photographed. For the first time, people said the word drown aloud, as if speaking it could scare off its shadow. For the first time, someone said maybe he fell in deliberately, and 3 faces turned to that person and said with the silence of a full-handed slap that not every hypothesis has earned its voice. On the 4th day, a team of divers with more experience and better equipment arrived from Athens with a van that rattled when it braked and a bill that did not make friends. They brought sonar and confidence that hid carefully behind words like procedure and protocol. They ran a sweep line across the cove and drew a map that looked like a mouth with bad teeth. They pointed at a shadow and said it might be a rock and might be a person, and then argued with themselves about how long a person remains a person in the sea. They went down with tethered lines and emerged silt-bearded and shook their heads and said nothing that helped the mother who had arrived that morning and stood on the road in the kind of shoes you do not wear on gravel, because suddenly you do not know how long you will be standing anywhere. His mother's name was Gertrude. She held a photograph of Matthias that she had carried for years in a wallet, a square trimmed by scissors into the size of proof. In it, he looked like someone who could not quite believe the camera was necessary. She asked Stavros to take her to the lighthouse, and he said no, and then yes, and then told her that she could come, but must look from the car. She sat and watched the sea perform its old trick of looking honest. She asked every person who went by whether they had seen her son, and each one said the truth with a different face. She asked the priest if he believed in miracles. He said he believed in water and in the people who move through it, and in the way a boat knows its harbor. He said he believed in patience. She said she did not have patience, and he said you will, because the body grows it the way the body grows callous when it must. By the end of the week, the formal search ended because formal searches run on fuel and paperwork, and those are things even grief cannot commandeer after a point. A smaller informal search continued, the one islands specialize in. A fisherman who goes a bit farther out than usual and checks, a man who walks a path and whistles in case someone answers, a boy with a long reach who explores a crack in rock, because cracks do not frighten boys. Someone said a light was seen on the path after midnight. Someone said a scream was heard, and then took that back because it had been the sound of a gull arguing with the night. Someone said they had heard of a German who bought the sort of shoes that do not hold on rock. Someone else said such talk was useless because a shoe is not a verdict. The official report said the words official reports say when they are asked to fill the space between absence and anyone's need to name it. Missing person. Last seen near Lighthouse. Extensive search conducted by local police, Coast Guard, volunteers. No personal effects recovered. Area includes cliffs, sea caves, variable currents. Presumed accidental fall into the sea. The line, no foul play suspected, landed with that thud that suggests someone somewhere raised the possibility anyway. A case number became the way the police could hold the story without letting it spill onto their desks. The island folded the absence into itself the way the sea folds things into its ordinary. This is not the same as forgetting. It is the more durable cousin of it. Years rearranged themselves. New paint faded on the cafe sign and was repainted and faded again. Sons left and came back when their fathers had knees that did not trust ladders. A woman married a man she had once sworn not to speak to again and shouted at him on Tuesdays and loved him on Sundays and on days when the wind died. The lighthouse's bulb was changed by a contractor who did not know the man who had once cared for it the way some people care for a dog, by talking to it when no one else is listening. Tourists came and took the photograph every tourist takes of the path, of the lighthouse, of the sea sprawled like a map that refuses to show roads. Every July, on the week the ledger in the police station reminded Stavros, Gertrude returned with a little bouquet of flowers she bought at the Athens airport because the island did not produce the sort she insisted on. She left them at the gate to the lighthouse because the chain was always there and always the same. She walked to the priest's house and did not cry in front of him, and then cried into the coffee he made her because a certain kind of unsweetened black gives a good dark cover for salt. She went to the harbor and watched the boats and did not like the sea. She tried to like the sea because to dislike it was to be angry at a wall built before your house was built, but she could not. She went back to Munich and kept Matthias's apartment on and paid for the electricity though the lamp in the hallway went unused and the plants died and were replaced and died again. People proposed explanations the way people always do, because hypotheses are the footbridges we build to cross the river between what we know and what will not tell us anything. Some said he fell because his eyes were on the light in his camera instead of the rock under his feet. Some said he climbed down too far on an outgoing tide, and an incoming surge convinced him to reconsider walking. Some said he was pushed by a fate that prefers small theatrics to grand cruelty. A few said something darker because every island has a story about smugglers and debt, and the way some nights are a little more complicated than others. The police checked the nights when scuffed shoes and hurried engines have to be explained, and found nothing that refused to be explained. Stavros told anyone who tried to sell him ghosts that he preferred the facts because the facts were hard enough to hold. He did not tell them that sometimes he woke hearing the word help in a voice he had assigned to the missing man, and that on those nights he drove the road and sat where he had sat on the first night and waited for the kind of mistake vultures make when they want to be something else. In 2008, 12 years after a man stepped down steps that had not been meant for his feet and vanished into a geography that had no obligation to return him, a fisherman named Nikos went out before dawn to pull a net he had set when the wind and his cousin had agreed the timing was good. The sky to the north was the color of old iron. The air was the kind that makes ropes heavy. He had been fishing those rocks since he could carry a bucket. He knew the sea's moods the way a shepherd knows which sheep will try a fence and which will respect it. The swell from a storm 2 islands away sulked itself down in long, sullen motions. He pulled the net hand over hand. The weights knocked like bones against the hull. It snagged in a way that did not feel like rock. He swore and then apologized to the boat because sometimes men talk to objects when they would prefer not to talk to themselves. He called his cousin forward to help, and together they dragged the net up until there was a shape on deck that was too heavy and also too light. Fish? His cousin asked, making a joke he did not like the taste of the minute it left his mouth. Not fish, Nikos said. He moved aside seaweed and plastic that had been a bag and kelp with the smell of basements and the sort of jellyfish that has no respect for hands. The thing in the middle was shaped like a question mark that someone had been interrupted in writing. It was pale where other things were dark, a curve of hard-linked notches. He did not touch it. He had touched many things the sea had returned and knew which ones not to. He made the sign of the cross in a way that did not ask for an audience. "Call Stavros," he said, and his cousin said, "Stavros is asleep." And Nikos said, "Wake him as if you were the wind." Stavros stood by the net and did the thing police chiefs do when mysteries are old and the people who are expected to answer questions can offer only forms. He stared long enough for the rest of the crew to become sure of what they were seeing, so he did not have to say it out loud. He arranged for the net to be lifted to the dock without spectacle. The village, which had learned over generations to resist the pretty temptation to make a spectacle of sorrow, did what it knows to do. It looked long enough to see and then went about its mourning with the polite speed of people returning a room to order after a guest has been ill. In the police station, the package sat in a box lined with white paper because the priest had said there should be whiteness around certain facts. Stavros called Athens, and then called the island's doctor, and then called no one else because the island would do the rest. The forensic team came from Athens 2 days later because fairies are obedient to weather, not to grief. The woman who led the team had done this sort of work long enough that she had learned how to treat the living and the dead with equal respect without making it look like she had rehearsed it. "Human," she said after a minute, pointing to the vertebrae with a pencil she did not write with. "Adult. Male probable given size and density. Age. We will see." She bagged and labeled and wrote a number in tidy writing. The island doctor did not ask to keep a souvenir. The priest did not bless the evidence without being asked. The box traveled to the ferry, and then to a van, and then to a table where instruments with names that hide their own feelings had their say. In Munich, in a flat that had been kept like a museum no one visited, a drawer that had contained a toothbrush in 1996 contained still a toothbrush because a mother had accepted that strands of her son's hair were a more durable archive of him than the calendar she continued to turn each first of the month. DNA did its unpoetic arithmetic. It said yes. This vertebral column belonged to the person whose hair had been wound in a paper tissue in a drawer for 12 years because some people have the audacity to be practical about miracles. The lab told the police in Athens. Athens told Stavros. Stavros told the priest because on islands certain sentences pass through certain mouths to temper them. The priest told no one because he is better at that than the police. The phone call to Munich was answered by a voice that had long since rearranged itself into the shape of a woman waiting for one particular sort of news. "Ja," she said, and then went silent, and then said, "Ja." Again, because sometimes one needs to teach the body a small word before the rest of the language is willing to come back. The funeral in Freiburg held less and more than a person. People who had known Matthias as a quiet man who never owed anyone money and always answered emails brought the sort of flowers the florist recommended. The priest there spoke about the sea in a voice that had known rivers better and made the difference sound small. The eulogy was written by a friend who had been surprised by how much he had loved Matthias only after he had to write about him. He was a man who loved to walk to the edge of maps, the friend said, and believed the ground would be there. The coffin was small because bones arranged themselves into sentences that contained fewer words than the living do. His mother stood and did not cry at the prescribed moments, and then later, when a dishwasher hummed and a woman she did not like had her hand on her forearm saying there, she wept so hard that 2 glasses moved on the shelf. On the island, the lighthouse kept its rhythm. Tourists still walked the path, and now some of them stopped at a small plaque someone had bolted to a rock where someone else had said it should be, in memory of the traveler who never returned. The plaque had been paid for with small folded bills in a jar at the Cafinio that had started as a joke and then become a collection because jokes are one way people give themselves permission to do a kind thing. The police file was stamped closed in a way that felt to Stavros like stamping a ledger in which your own name sits twice in pencil. He had a copy of one photograph of the vertebrae and never looked at it again because he did not need the image to remember the shape of the absence. Because people like to put finished frames around pictures that do not have borders, the story traveled, picked up sentences in airports and newspapers and online, where it learned to wear louder shoes. Mystery of the Lighthouse, it was called in one place. The spine in the net, in another, as if what the net had hauled up was the plot itself. Theories, always eager to work, returned to their posts. Some were mundane and therefore likely. He slipped on wet stone, he misjudged a ledge, he went down to a cave and did not accept that a tide could be so abrupt. Some were barbed for flavor. He was robbed and thrown. He was involved in something involving money and boats no one discussed in daylight. He had faked his disappearance, and then the sea had punished his audacity by refusing to cooperate with fictions. The police, who are paid badly to be unenchanted, said the words they could be paid more to say and never would. We do not know. And that is the honest line between dignity and guess. The fishermen on Akritos do not tell the story badly. They say a man went to the edge and the sea took him, and then, because the sea is as sentimental as any creature that lives long, it gave back what it could without stooping to gallantry. They say that certain days in September when the wind comes from the mainland and then forgets why it came. If you stand on the path above the skerries, you can smell metal where there is no rust. They say that the caves under the cliffs are connected to larger rooms that a diver cannot enter without promising himself to the stone, and that inside those rooms objects, animal and human and otherwise, wait for a storm whose fingerprint fits the lock that water is. They say all this with shrug and smile because to say it with emphasis would be to hijack grief with performance, and the island is too old to be theatrical for its own sake. The forensic report was both exactly what anyone could have predicted and exactly what a mother had hoped not to read. It said male, adult, likely 35 to 45 at time of death. It said no cut marks, no obvious trauma to the vertebrae, no sign of things done by hands, only by water and time. It said likely disarticulation at joints due to prolonged submersion and movement in currents. It used the phrase secondary deposition due to storm activity, which in plain language means the sea keeps a pantry and sometimes empties a shelf when it rearranges the kitchen. It offered no list of the rest, because bones that are not found do not lend themselves to enumeration. It said the spine had been trapped in the net because the net had been where the spine wanted, for its own reasons, to be. Elise, the German who had argued about the lighthouse on her first trip and who had stopped coming after the fourth year because the island's north wind had started to feel to her like a judge, read the story online in a newspaper that had illustrated it with a stock photograph of a lighthouse that was not the one on Akritos. She cursed the wrong photograph and then cried because it was not the photograph she was crying about. She wrote a letter to his mother that began with the sentence, "I do not know what to do with my hands," and ended with the sentence, "May your sleep learn how to return." She collected her own set of small artifacts, ticket stubs from the Athens bus, a rock she was not meant to pick up, a photograph in which he was not present, but in which she had intended him to be, and put them into a drawer marked with the kind of label that reads like an instruction to the body. Enough. There is an epilogue. Islands prefer that cities do not know how to tell. It is not complicated, only long. It says, a person was here, and then the sea had a conversation with gravity, and the wind took a position, and stone did what it has always done, which is not move, not until its mood is shifted by water. It says, we went to look and we learned what it means to be small in a way that was not humiliating but accurate. It says, the body of the island remembers in more ways than one. The path grows a rut where 100 feet stood and waited. The plaque gets polished by wind. At the Cafinio, someone tells a child that the northern rocks are not a playground. The child rolls his eyes, and then 2 years later repeats the sentence to a younger child, as if he had invented it. In the police station, Stavros retires and his mustache retires with him, and a younger officer takes the case file out, wants to understand what it means to be responsible for a number that is not going to change. She reads, and she writes in the margin, flowers left at Lighthouse 17/7 each year, because dignity sometimes reveals its address only in such addenda. Every November, the paint on the lighthouse flakes off in exactly the places it flaked off before. Every spring, the bougainvillea tries to colonize another wall and is reminded politely by a woman with secateur that while ambition is admirable, boundaries are also a kind of grace. Once every few years, a storm from the Black Sea takes its time arriving and then stays a week and then leaves behind a beach that the island's children do not recognize because the stones have rearranged themselves into a new paragraph. That week, the fishermen do not go out. Nikos mends nets he has mended enough times to call personal. He looks at the spot on deck where once a thing lay that became the island's story, and he does not taste salt in his mouth because the body refuses to carry certain flavors twice. There is a bench now near the lighthouse. Not part of a plan drawn by any council, but the result of a carpenter who lost a brother and decided against chairs for this place. The bench is plain wood, sealed against weather with oil rubbed in by hand, because brushes make a finish that is too proud. On the bench sometimes sits a German woman with a face that would remind Gertrude of her younger face if she were still alive. The woman reads a book she does not follow. She has come because she read the story in a newspaper that had used the wrong photograph and thought that she might prefer the right photograph. She writes a postcard and does not send it. In the postcard she writes, the sea is flat today. The light turns and turns. I do not forgive anything, but I do not wish to be unkind to the wind. The island accepts and continues. That is what islands do. They collect stories the way they collect driftwood, and then they make fences of the stories and sometimes boats. When a person stands on the path and looks down and thinks, it would be easy to go a few steps farther, they do not hear the island say out loud, do not let the sentence end without you. The island cannot speak that way. But goats shuffle in a certain pattern, and a gust of wind leans in exactly the way a hand on a shoulder leans, and a gull scrapes the air with a sound like the metal edge of a rule on a desk. And sometimes that is how people do not die. And yet people do die? This is not a failure of advice or a success of elements. It is the part of the contract that no one negotiated, the clause under force majeure, that the gods insisted on. Matthias walked to the far point of the map because he was the sort of person who believed that light and water and wind were things his feet could read like ink. He stood on rock older than any promise he had made to himself. He decided to stay 1 minute more than sense, for reasons that cannot be shamed because they are so ordinary. The sea did what the sea does when the wind and the mouth of a cave argue, and the cave wins. In the ledger of a small police station on an island that will not be on the maps of people who do not want to know where they are, a line was written, and then, 12 years later, the sea amended it, found it aloud, and placed on the page not a period but a comma, and after the comma the island wrote what islands write when they are done speaking. The lighthouse turns. The net is mended. The path is walked by feet that know and by feet that do not. The water breathes in and out. The names that mattered are the ones not spoken by tourists who prefer correct vowels to quiet. And the living go home, and the dead make the place their home in the manner that is no one's business but the sea's. If you stand there at dusk, on the week in July when the plum trees in the village are ridiculous with fruit, and the old men throw stones at cats not because they hate them, but because that is how they say go, you can see the lighthouse's beam thin out in air that has not yet decided what color it wishes to be. You can hear the boom of a cave when a wave chooses not to be careful. You can feel in your soles the panic of rock that has been lied to by water for centuries and still tries not to be moved. You can hold in your head the shape of a spine and think of how it held a man upright for 40 years and then, when it was done with that, became the way a story held itself up on an island for 12 more. You can say nothing, and that will be the correct amount of speech. You can think of a mother and not imagine her, because imagination is a poor cook of grief. You can put your hand on the bench and feel the oil and think that some hands bothered to make a place for sitting in a world that mostly wants us to keep walking. And then you can walk back, as carefully as words can be placed in a letter to someone who will read it more than once. And the wind will let you pass, and the goats will permit your sentence to continue. And you will return not with an explanation, but with the recognition that explanation is not always the food the body needs to carry on. When Nikos tells the story now, in the harbor where ropes go slack or taut, with a mathematics older than algebra, he uses fewer words each year. He says, "It was early, there was a storm in the distance, I pulled the net, I saw it, I called Stavros, and we did what people do." If someone asks what the sea keeps, he says the sea keeps the rest, and this is not cruelty, it is inventory. If someone asks whether it was the German, he says yes, and gives the name, because names are the only parts of us the sea cannot digest. If someone asks what the moral is, he says that perhaps the moral is nothing to do with the dead at all, but with the living. Do not make appointments with the edges of things at hours when they do not consent. Do not believe a warning sign is decoration. Do not assume the world owes you footing because you have a plan. If someone asks whether he sleeps well, he says sometimes the boat keeps moving even on land, and that is not sleep, but it is also not entirely not sleep. There is a last small item in the police file, handwritten by the younger officer in a neat, careful script. Unidentified person leaves flowers at Lighthouse each July 17th. It is not a lead. It is a kindness attached to a case that will never shrug itself shut properly. It is followed by another note in different ink and in a different hand. Bird nest found in padlock loop of lighthouse door. Removed and relocated by maintenance. These are the sorts of sentences that outlive protagonists. A place accrues them. Accredos has always been a place that believes in the accruing of sentences rather than the finishing of them. What remains is what always remains after oceans have their say. A white line of salt on a step where a wave reached farther than usual. A photograph of a man in boots whose shoes are now emphatically not whatever they were once meant to be. A mother who learns to measure time by flowers. A fisherman who tells a story with his hands so that words can rest. A lighthouse that turns and turns and turns, alerting no one and everyone that the edge is both near and farther away than we guess, and that soft truth that the sea, which never owes us anyone back, sometimes returns a fraction, as if to prove it knows our names, and expects us to understand that fractions are what love must make do with when the whole is gone.